All right. All right, we're live. So this afternoon's discussion, Night's Watch today will focus on the case of Babadook. So where would the group like to start? Amelia? Okay.
Yeah.
So what did you observe?
Well, she's definitely seeing something, a hallucination, a monster. It seems to be progressing and progressively. The hallucinations, like when she sees Oscar, it's like now it's tactile because she can touch it, and then she's experiencing like auditory hallucinations. She can hear the monster, and so it seems to be progressively getting more.
Yep. So a couple of things probably to discuss, and this really is this group's perspective and what the consensus is, and how you want to literally view what the observation is, and that is this an artist representation, the writer-producer, of an auditory hallucination? So are they just showing us what Amelia is hearing? Because that's meaningful, and we can say that Amelia is experiencing auditory hallucinations. On the other hand, if you think that you'd like to interpret this more verbatim, and that these are true visual hallucinations, that there's no creative liberty taken by the director, that's probably going to change our differential diagnosis, because once visual hallucinations are observed or are reported, where does the clinician's mind then go? Sorry?
More medical things like.
Exactly right. Right. So we all often refer to as an organic pathology. That is, individuals who suffer from visual hallucinations have a higher likelihood of a medical condition or the effects of a substance contributing to the perceptual disturbance, more specifically, the visual hallucination. Mm-hmm. If we were to adopt that perspective, is there any evidence in this movie that Amelia has an underlying medical condition? And I want you to answer this twofold. One, quite simply, by asking yourself, is there something literally in the script that gives us our answer to say, you know what, these are visual, because in timestamp 10 minutes and 30 seconds, we see this. So I'm taking the radio silence as no, right? Let's then, step two, address this like you would a board question, maybe a shelf question. That is, does the absence of such information then reassure you, the test taker, to cross general medical condition off your list? And why or why not? But if I rephrase the question, what might you change if the writer-director decided to consult you? That the edit of which would have resulted in your saying, yes, definitively, in the absence of discrete information, I'd still cross medical condition off my list because of blank. What are the two protective factors when it comes to having underlying medical condition of any type, including those that can manifest as behavioral signs?
Normal checkups or something.
Unfortunately, that very rarely happens, right? But exactly right. So if I give you that information, or if the information were in the script, absolutely. Female sex. Females are just healthier than males. Right? So on board exams, females are the operational definition of health. The other protective factor would be what then?
Social support.
Okay, more of a biological factor. Age, yeah. The younger you are, the healthier. Now, of course, are there exceptions to the rule? Absolutely. But those exceptions are usually with physical health findings or physical findings on exam. In the absence of such, i.e. discrete evidence in a script, you can look at a younger person who is of female sex as the operational definition of health. That's per the national board exam. That's per the shelf exam. Unfortunately, Amelia has one protective factor and one risk factor. She's older and female. Now, of course, if she were male this were a male figure cast as the lead, we'd say no. Easy answer. No, this would not reassure me because she has both risk factors. But she's in the intermediate category, which means that you're not likely to see this on a shelf exam. However, you could obviously see this on a real life encounter. And as intermediate risk, how you pursue this will ultimately be up to you and how you care for your patients, conservatively or not. If you're conservative, you're going to treat this as going to along the lines of two risk factors, more towards that end of the spectrum. If you're less conservative, you're probably going to be more towards the pole of two protective factors. But this is an intermediate risk, so we have to leave it in our differential. Right? So the absence of information does not fully reassure us that Amelia's perceptual disturbances are not induced by an underlying medical condition. Similarly, is there any evidence in the script, discreetly so, that there's use of a substance? No, there isn't. Next question. Does the absence of such information reassure you as the provider that therefore the Babadook is not a fictional account of a substance-induced mental disorder? And the answer here is always no. Irrespective of sex, age, or whatever, substances always play a role until you discover that they don't. So that will remain up in our differential as well. Questions about how to address, well, psychotic symptoms in general, but visual hallucinations in particular here. All right, so in addition to the perceptual disturbances, what else do we have? What else did you notice?
I mean, she had like this major trauma 5-6 years ago where she witnessed the death of her husband in the car crash while she's delivering her child, Sam, I think. And since then, that has been a kind of pervasive, a really hard topic for her to discuss and bring up, especially since we now have evidence that she never celebrates his birthday because it's the same day that her husband passed away. And we don't necessarily know what happened prior to this movie in terms of her symptoms, whether she's having nightmares, flashbacks, feelings of anxiety regarding it. And we can't necessarily deny that she wasn't having them or say that, yeah, they're definitely there. But there may be a component of PTSD involved here that may have triggered some sort of psychotic phase or a brief psychotic disorder of some sort.
Yeah, I think with a trauma this significant and the consequent behavior, not celebrating her son's birthday, which in itself is probably going to be traumatic for a mom. We can't dismiss PTSD. And then I think once we discover what happened with Oscar, certainly people in a clerkship, the psychiatry clerkship, would begin to watch this movie with a specific eye towards any of the signs and symptoms that would rule in for post-traumatic stress disorder. Right? And given that Oscar was Sam is about 5 or 6, maybe 5, this is clearly enduring. So not acute stress disorder, but instead post-traumatic stress disorder.
I think she does also mention when she has that kind of argument with her sister, I guess. She said, or the sister brings up directly that she avoids talking about it and has been for many years. So that's one of like kind of the, tick marks, I guess, for PTSD.
Yeah, and we could piggyback this on a conversation that we had on all things, but including the kiss hell out, right? Avoidance behavior in what context? Well, here we see avoidance behavior perhaps being part of a larger disorder. And then again, piggybacking this morning's conversation beyond just avoidant personality traits. Here, you might actually have additional signs and symptoms that eventually rule in for PTSD. And is what we observed with an interaction with Amelia's sister, evidence of that. Other interesting behaviors or scenes observed in Babadook pertaining to Amelia.
I think this is also mentioned by the sister that she doesn't like going to the house because it's like depressing at the house or something. It's like gloomy, kind of dark. So I think it's alluded to a few times that there are some kind of depressive episode symptoms. I mean, like the sleep problems, are pretty prominent throughout, but it's a little bit like tied with, I think, like psychosis, so. But there is definitely like a depression, like an MDD or mood, episode kind of, throughout the thing.
I want to talk a little bit about tying it with psychosis in just a second, but before we get there, and that does need to be discussed. Can we now draw a timeline to this in terms of the evolution of what appears to have been or appears to be a major depressive episode? So upon the death of her husband, what is the single best answer most likely to appear on a shelf exam if a clinical vignette, and how cool would this be, mirrored the plot of Babadook or the Babadook?
It's hard to say because as far as we know, she's been kind of depressed since like the death of her husband. So like the movie starts and then that's the timeline. So as long as Sam has been living, which is like 6 years.
Right. But let's say the clinical vignette on your shelf is one day after the death of her husband.
You're
Dot, dot,
gonna
dot.
have like the psychotic, like the,
Oh, no,
or
just the dysphoria.
creep.
Hmm?
Creep.
Yes, this is again, remember, we're going to call this a normal grief reaction until it's not. Now, again, in about 5 seconds, when she starts talking about this shadowy creature in her bedroom, all right, you got us. But let's always reset our brains as clinicians as believing that what our patient's story is bound in reality and normal. It's always got to be our starting point. So this is a grief reaction, otherwise known as bereavement. What if, however, this becomes protracted and clinically significant?
Complex bereavement.
Right. Persisting complex bereavement disorder, otherwise known as complicated grief or complicated bereavement. What happens next if we begin to see additional signs develop, including, that is additional to the depressed mood, including the difficulty sleeping, difficulty concentrating, etc.? Then what? MDD. And 5 years out, that's exactly what might be happening. And now we may actually have a case formulation on the etiology of her major depressive disorder. Right. Starting out with bereavement, evolving to persisting complex bereavement disorder, then to a major depressive episode. And perhaps, and this is where the second part of our question is, maybe even major depressive disorder with psychotic features.
I think the thing that initially when I was watching the movie, like you were saying, because I'm in the clerkship and looking for diagnoses and the thing, my first thought was schizophrenia, but what I realized we don't actually have a clear timeline of is what symptoms are like when she is not acutely psychotic, or maybe during the rest of the year. Because I think the neighbor says, I know this is like a difficult time for you. So is this like, does she have kind of MDD with psychotic features around the time of her husband's death / her son's birth, or is she kind of baseline kind of like psychotic almost? So like, is it like schizoaffective, or is it frank schizophrenia where she has kind of psychosis throughout the year and then or not throughout, but like very prominent psychosis, I guess. And then this is like a mood episode tied to, or like we don't know the in-betweens, I guess, and what she was like throughout the rest of the year. And I think that would be like the key distinguishing thing between like that kind of group of diagnoses.
Yeah, it would be, and you gave the answer to my next question. It's exactly what we need to discuss. The answer already provided, timelines and timeframes. Because when people like Amelia present, whether it's in a film, The Babadook, whether it's in an office, or whether it's in an OSCE or test, shelf exam, you're going to see someone in a slice of time that is demonstrating both mood and psychotic symptoms. And you're going to have to figure out the chicken and the egg, right? Because if in Amelia's case, we actually do go back in time and it is revealed that she demonstrates mood symptoms, specifically depression, without psychosis, then we establish this as a primary mood disorder, specifically major depressive disorder with psychotic features. If on the other hand, the alternative actually is teased out, that is, Amelia does in fact demonstrate in the prequel psychotic features in the absence of mood, and maybe the death is a precipitant of an additional episode, then this is a primary psychotic disorder. And the name of that psychotic disorder would likely be schizoaffective disorder, right? So we've got to tease out the patient's past psychiatric history. Right. Questions about Amelia when it comes to the concurrent or co-occurring mood and psychotic features. One other dilemma here that I want you to consider when you're, again, treating people and reading through a case vignette on a shelf exam is that about 20% of individuals with major depression will experience psychotic features. And Amelia likely is such a case. By the way, I referred to a prequel. There is no prequel. Of course, we could build it to determine what once and for all is her ailment. On the other hand, individuals with established bipolar disorder have a point prevalence of psychotic features of 50%, 50. So just because of the relative incidence, we have to consider bipolar here as well. Now, I don't, so, and again, twofold. Now, and again, this will be mirrored with regard to the patient interview. Number one is, does the patient demonstrate any dig fast, right? Those signs and symptoms that literally define a manic episode. Did you see any of it here? Is there any increase in goal-directed activity? Risk-taking behavior? Elevated or expansive mood?
Maybe like sleep disturbances.
For the sleep disturbance, is it insomnia or is it a decreased need for sleep due to a burst of energy?
So, yeah.
Yeah, so probably less likely to be mania, right? Okay. However, we're only halfway there, because if our answer is no, but in the prequel, it's revealed that 15 years prior, there was in fact a manic episode. Boy, does that change the scope. Because one manic episode results in a lifetime illness called bipolar 1 disorder. So even though we don't necessarily observe anything in this particular movie, we can't definitively rule against bipolar being the mood disorder with psychotic features. And given the prevalence, 50%, we have to keep that in the back of our minds. That is, somebody's got to build this prequel. Anything else with Amelia?
So I'm thinking specifically about the scene in the police station, where she kind of notices that the policemen are looking at her strangely. Does that indicate that she has some sort of insight of kind of what is going on in her head might be abnormal?
Good. It certainly could. And if you interpret that scene as such, that probably, I think, supports a primary mood disorder over a primary psychotic process, right? I would think for an established psychotic disorder such as schizoaffective disorder, and that includes schizophrenia as well, in terms of just point prevalence, you're likely to see a deficit in insight, a relative deficit, that is, compared to a primary mood disorder. So that might be supportive of Amelia's ailment, her primary mental disorder being a depressive disorder, specifically major depression with psychotic features. Could be.
What do you, sorry, what do you make of the ending of the movie? We were kind of talking about this earlier. But like the Babadook obviously is still there and she's kind of still feeding it, but has it like under control or kind of like under wraps?
One of the reasons why I love this movie is because there's something called, I don't think it's a true double bind, but it kind of runs parallel to what psychology has defined as the double bind, right? Anybody recall what this is? So Bateman suggested that when individuals get two simultaneous but opposite communications, that could cause distress. And in the 1950s or so, it was actually thought to be a cause for schizophrenia. And because these messages within the family structure usually came from mom, it derived the term, the schizophrenogenic mother. All of the above has been debunked. Right now, We know the double bind having miscommunication, like doing one thing but saying the other consistently throughout an individual's development could be problematic, despite the fact that it doesn't cause schizophrenia. But you could see how it could certainly increase the risk for mood and anxiety disorders. In a similar context, I take this ending to be very ambivalent, because I think at first glance, you almost feel as if, I don't know if I could use the word feel good ending, but you kind of take a little bit of a sigh of relief. But intellectually, when you discuss the ending, which of course we're about to do, I think the direct opposite is going to be our conclusion. So I don't think, just as a teaser, things are as they seem. Now, before we get there, I want to first talk about and go back to this evolution that we painted, this progression of dysphoria in the character of Amelia. That again started out with a normal grief reaction and looks as if it's evolved to major depressive disorder with psychotic features. Because as she is grieving, we could try to superimpose Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief and see how those stages, that stage theory kind of fits with the narrative of the Babadook. So what are the 5 stages of grief proposed by Kubler-Ross? Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Perfectly. Good. All right. So when we begin watching this movie and we begin observing Amelia's behavior, it looks as if this particular character is fixated in the denial stage. Right? And I think the Babadook happens to be some manifestation of Amelia's denial. That's the role I think this monster plays. It's what is eating her alive. Do you see her angry? She does. Yep. Can you give me a scene in which she gets angry?
He's in bed and Sam's like, I'm hungry. She tells him,
You have to quote her.
yeah, she tells him to eat his poop.
Okay. Now, at first glance, we're not going to call that anger per Kubler-Ross, because anger in the stage theory is towards the deceased. Why did you leave me? How dare you leave me? However, this fits. How?
Because she's tired of like Sam and putting up with him,
Right?
and she, yeah. I feel like she just doesn't want to be bothered with her.
I think her anger is also directed towards Sam because like they were on their way to the hospital for his sort of birth. So like there's like a direct tie there, kind of like maybe it's not after deceased, but it's like, you know, his offspring that was kind of also the cause. So it's like all kind of one thing.
And what does the field of psychology call that redirected anger?
Oh,
Perfect, right? She's angry. Okay. And it does fit the stage theory if you understand displacement. Any bargaining?
Yeah. When, I don't know, trying to understand, but like when Oscar is like, if you bring me the boy, but I don't know if that's really in what lens, if we're gonna view that as bargaining.
At least an allusion to bargaining. I think we're all comfortable in saying that Amelia is fixated at the depressed stage of Kubler-Ross's theory. And then, of course, we're working towards acceptance, right? Quick teaching note, right? Teaching Pearl. When Kubler-Ross proposes this stage theory for death and dying, she actually proposed it as going linearly through these successive steps, but later revised her theory, right? So people can skip steps, right? They could regress back to steps. And as you can see, they can actually cross multiple steps. And that's exactly what's happening here in the Babadook. It really fits with her later revision and serves as a teaching point as to how Kubler-Ross did in fact revise her original theory. fits almost perfectly. How does this movie end? So I'm gonna just re-ask the question you asked me. Now, knowing what we know about these different stages of grief, how should we interpret the ending?
Seems like she's moved towards acceptance because she's celebrating Sam's birthday. They've never celebrated Sam's birthday before. When Sam asks her, how are you doing today? He like directly like acknowledging like how she's feeling. She says, I'm feeling a little better today. So it does seem like there's some level of acceptance.
Because he's still lingering there in her basement and she's still like feeding it, which makes me think that like you're right on the edge of just kind of regressing back to where she was.
Denial,
Yeah.
right? To the extent that the Babadook is a manifestation and a representation of Amelia's denial, it's there. So we're straddling, I think, very, very cautiously, really the beginning, the alpha and the omega of the stage theory. And in one sense, I can understand how this might be acceptance, especially or as evidenced by her being able to celebrate Sam's birthday. But on the other hand, she is feeding her denial, which makes me incredibly eager to watch the sequel because it's going to go one way or the other. And my gut says is that the opening scene is going to give us an answer. And if this movie is 90 minutes, it's probably not going to be acceptance. Right. So I'm going to say this is probably evidence that is the ending, evidence that she has regressed back to denial and she is feeding that denial, those earthy worms.
And I think also if we're kind of talking about timeline, and we also don't know, like, this is immediately after, or this is after the birthday passes. Like, if it's more along the lines of like ambiguous psychotic features, like has she kind of returned to her baseline of there's no mood symptoms, there's no psychosis anymore, and you know, has she like truly accepted it, or has this mood episode with psychosis like is it over for the time being, and that's why it's kind of in the back, just it's gonna, you know, it can come back, like it's, I think they also show like the door has several like new locks around it or something, so it's like can it come back, or will it come back? Maybe like has this happened before, maybe not to the extent of this particular movie, but like has it happened before on his birthdays or around his birthdays or something, and this is just like another episode that we are getting to see and we just haven't seen the other ones.
Right. And again, that would be consistent with or supportive of this being a primary mood disorder. We would expect more of it being more of an episodic illness than, let's say, a primary psychotic disorder like schizoaffective, where it's a chronic and persistent mental disorder. So what appears to be resolution at the end might just be an inter-episode. And again, suggesting that the sequel's something to look forward to. I'm not sure if they're making it. But more importantly, perhaps further support of this being a primary mood disorder, as we would expect major depressive episodes do occur in episodic fashion.
And it's interesting too, because even Sam's like, oh, can I go see it? And she's like, I'll show you when you're older.
Older, yeah,
So
that's
that's kind
the
of
thing.
Yeah.
Yep. Again, sequel.
I also had kind of an interpretation of the ending of the movie as being kind of Sam's, like a child's kind of understanding of kind of a scary event, because I mean Sam's a child, you know, so he, you know, like especially at the beginning, he has all of these cult behavioral issues, and it's, you know, I think when we were watching it at first, it was unclear if Sam truly had behavioral problems, or at first it was presented that he did. And I feel like as the movie went on, it kind of was more like, okay, or maybe he was just coping with his mother's psychotic symptoms. And in a child who, you know, he's, I don't know if it's ever said exactly how old he is, but if he has a mother who is telling him there's a monster or something, is that like, are those behavioral problems of him carrying around weapons, of him screaming, or not have it, like not being able to be soothed, or having kind of an anxious kind of behavior? Like, are those true behavioral problems, you know, something like conduct disorder, or is it more that this is how a child is coping with a mother's like psychotic kind of feature? Because I don't think it's ever clear, or I don't think it's ever alluded to that he's actually seeing the monster at all. It's always just kind of, he's afraid of it and preparing for it, but I don't think they ever show him directly like interacting with or appearing to react to like an actual monster.
Yep.
So my interpretation of the ending was more that this kind of physically locking a monster in the basement was more of like a child's interpretation of kind of this like of this mother's like psychotic event that has improved.
Yeah, actually, let's talk about that. I think there's 2 points to make here. Number one is, I think, again, alluding back to the way we'll always approach situations like this. And that is, Samuel's behavior is normal and normal for a child because we feel that it is developmentally appropriate. Right. And this is a little bit of a Stephen King twist. I mean, Stephen King will often talk about how killer clowns that live in sewers are perfectly fine for children because if they have an imagination that could conjure such a sinister being, they also have the imagination to create a weapon that would kill it. Right. Adults don't have that. You know, if you saw the clown pop out of the sewer, you know, and float, that's problematic for us, right? To say the least. So what you're saying, I think, and one point you've made is consistent with where we should look in terms of how to approach this, and that it is in fact developmentally appropriate until proven otherwise. That does then bring up the conversation of whether Amelia suffered from postpartum depression. We would expect that the answer is yes. And because of that, was her child able to bond with her? And if not, the condition in children that might result is called analytic depression. And that might actually then be the counter to this being developmentally normal. So that's something to consider. There might be a defense mechanism here as well. Of course, fantasy is going to be at the top of our list, right? Again, the imagination that conjures the Babadook is also the imagination that conjures the magic in the sword that can slay the Babadook. There's another defense that I want to talk about, and that's splitting. And is Samuel demonstrating splitting as a defense? So what is splitting?
Perception of one thing as being all good and another thing is all bad.
Exactly right, right? Individuals at a young age, especially Samuel, especially a son to his mom, views, in this case, mom as perfect, ideal, right? That's normal. Until one day we discover she's not. Now, whether it's because she told you no, whether she is being persecuted by a Babadook, at some point, and perhaps Daniel discovered that my mom isn't perfect. Now, there's a lot of things that happen when that occurs, right? One of the ways in which we can actually get by this conflict, the anxiety that this causes us as a young 5-year-old, is through splitting. That is, we split the negative aspects, characteristics of mom to continue and be able to continue to idealize her. And what splits off becomes an imaginary friend, imbued with all of mom's negative characteristics. That might be the Babadook. By the way, that's every evil stepmother in every Disney film ever, right?
So I'm wondering also, because there's like that, it's like a psych thing, like it's French, so the fully.
Fully ado.
So I kind of wonder if maybe there was like an element of them kind of feeding off of each other, if the mom has some kind of psychosis, and then the child is presenting this idea of mom being persecuted by this monster. And then the mom interprets that as monster Babadook, which the child adopts again, because like, I don't think he brings up Babadook by himself. Like the mom reads the story and that's how he starts talking about the Babadook as being this monster. So I feel like there's like this kind of like back and forth slash, I don't know if I think maybe at the age that he is, this wouldn't be fully, I don't know, just because, yeah, is it like a true delusion or is he a child? But that's kind of the idea, maybe, that they have this kind of like back and forth of like, of you know, this quote delusion.
We can at least say that there might be a dynamic consistent with Folie à Deux that's playing a role here, in as much as we see the evolution of whatever it is that is making or evolving Samuel's behavior from normal and developmentally appropriate to abnormal.
I feel like it's interesting though, the notion of the splitting, because even from like the outset of the Babadook, Sam makes it very clear that he's just trying to protect her. And he's like, yeah, like I'll promise, like I won't talk about it. Like I'll promise to protect you if you promise to protect me. And even at the end, when she's like particularly kind of like scary, and I feel like it would be natural for him to run off, he like ties her up and he's like, I'm not gonna leave you. He's like, you gotta get it out. And she like vomits all up, I guess. What we're supposed to perceive is like all of the kind of like evil depression, all of those things. So it is very interesting because he is able to still maintain this image of her as like my mom and separate that from like this other person that he perceives as like being very negative.
Yep, I agree.
Can we ask you, another thing that came up was like the book, like the origin of
Yeah.
this book, and I kind of.
I was waiting for that.
Yeah. It kind of ties into what both Deshay and Karen were saying, we're like, is this, we perceive that mom possibly wrote this book, like Karen brought up a good point that the mom's a child, like she writes child's book for a living. So is it, but I was like curious if it ties into Karen's point where it's like one feeding into the other, and that's how you have the origin and the creation of this book.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I don't know if she was trying to journal as part of her treatment for depression. And that journaling just became the book, the bad book, right? That's the acronym, right? Or the anagram, excuse me, right? Babadook is the bad book. Say that louder collectively. one more time.
Yeah, because we were talking about why the book well, one, my whole question was, why is she reading
Reading
this
the-
book to her child?
Yeah.
Seems wildly inappropriate.
There's two A's, right?
Babadook, yeah.
I'm sorry, a bad book. Did I say the? Yeah, a bad book, I'm sorry. Which again parallels this with the film that is always paralleled, and that's The Shining, right? I mean, there's many people that think that Jack Torrance is interacting with family members that don't exist in the Overlook with him, but instead characters from his own book, but he's blacked out, right? Associative amnesia, right? Might be part of a PTSD picture.
So actually, that was the other question with the book thing is she also seems to have some kind of like, yeah, amnesia surrounding some of her like psychotic events. Like if this book was written by her, she has no recollection that she's the one that wrote it. Like if she has like these, like I think there's like a few, I'm kind of blanking, that's the main kind of example where she seems to just have no memory of this.
Mhm.
Or like the book reappearing on her foot, so like kind of taking it, as a horror movie, maybe it is some spiritual or some kind of monster, but if we're like analyzing it, like, did she put it back there?
She did.
She has no memory of it. which is,
Absolutely.
like amnesia. So.
Yeah, it dissociated. And now the only other question I have is, and the question that we have to address, beyond this probably being part of a PTSD spectrum, which we've already established, is whether or not when she's writing the book, she actually has a distinct personality state take over her conscious awareness, because if that is the case, this is even DID, right? And it's not just dissociative amnesia. But that's a question that I don't think is answered here. But again, the fact that there's a conspiracy theory attached to a book that the author of it in the film is basically the author of her own story is very consistent with the conspiracy theory of The Shining. And I think in this movie, there's even a bathroom scene of her trying to get in to the bathroom that is also, I think, an allusion to Kubrick's The Shining. I don't think she yells, here's Johnny when she gets through it, but any other thoughts about Amelia? We're going to skip over Samuel. Beyond my just stating the syndrome or the illness of analytic depression, we have no child adolescent psychiatrist available for further consultation. Other thoughts, other observations about the Babadook? How about if I just broke the news to you that you're all wrong? Nothing we talked about over the past 42 minutes actually has anything to do with the film. No? Well, it can't be told through the perspective of Samuel. Again, with full disclosure, I'm not a child adolescent psychiatrist, so it can't be him. Is there anybody else we might be missing? Yeah, what's going on, Mrs. Roach? What? Daughter? Yeah. Right, so Parkinson's, can this entire plot, can what we observed truly be perhaps the observations of a neighbor with established Parkinson's disease? And if so, what's the most likely diagnosis? What do we call the syndrome in someone with Parkinson's where they have visual hallucinations?
Lewy body dementia.
Yeah, this is what the movie's really about. Yeah. And if you looked at the DSM criteria, and I'll post this on Instagram later, but if you look at the DSM criteria for dementia, right, and that includes dementia related to Parkinson's disease, the actual DSM criteria spell out Roach, R-O-C-H, happens to be her last name.
And then there were
What's up?
Sorry, I was just like, I was like, why is she so like? It makes sense.
yeah,
I was gonna bring up that scene where, like, in the middle of that whole, like, what I guess is the climax of, you know, it seems like the Babadook is finally, you know, kind of driving Amelia to like essentially almost like attacking Sam. And there's that scene where she kind of interrupts, she knocks on their door, and I'm trying to remember exactly what she says, but I think that's the point where she says, I know this time of year is hard for you. I don't remember if she said, you know, I care about you and I want to help you. And then that scene just ends. And then like, it's never really clear what exactly happened there.
Again, try rewatching this film with that perspective that it's all told. This is Mrs. Roach's story, or Mrs. Roach's story. And if you rewatch this film with that perspective, it actually stays true. Right? Again, I will post the DSM criteria for major neurocognitive disorder a little later on, rearranged to fit the acronym Roach. One more question, and this is again for clinical as well as shelf purposes. We discussed this, I think, just last week. Perfect time to review. This condition of major neurocognitive disorder, whether due to Parkinson's disease, whether due to any other etiology, differentiates from mild neurocognitive disorder. How? Yeah. One is literally defined through it not being clinically significant. That's mild. Whereas, of course, like every other mental disorder, with the exception of hypomania, we have clinical significance attributed to major neurocognitive disorder, which I believe Mrs. Roach is afflicted with. Final thoughts, observations. All right, we'll leave it there. For those listening on the other end, we will be back in about just 5 minutes for a case presentation.